You're seeing on the news mass people go into places of business, farms, etc., rounding up people that they say don't belong. And naturally, a massive amount of people in the communities where this is happening come out to protest. And then after protesting and the protesters getting violent because nothing seems to be changing, the government sends in the military to try and crush the protesters. Now you may think this sounds like a scene in some third world country, but no. This is in the United States right now. And after this, you see all this reporting on the news saying this is just another scary indicator of America's slide towards authoritarianism. But what actually is authoritarianism, and what's the science behind it? Well, let's talk about the science behind that. And before we jump into today's episode, I just want to say if any of you have questions or comments about today's episode, you can send me an email at thesciencebt@gmail.com. And if I get any fun, unhinged emails from people who are angry about me talking about authoritarianism, I'll be sure to share them on the next episode of The Science Behind That podcast. Enjoy.
Welcome to The Science Behind That with Atticus Hamilton.
Hello, all you scientists, and welcome on back to The Science Behind That podcast. I'm your host, Atticus Hamilton, and as you heard in the intro, today we're going to be talking about authoritarianism. So this is a very important topic, and for all of my listeners listening to this who live in America, now more than ever, this is a very important topic. The concept of authoritarianism is appearing everywhere in the media, and the current administration, the Trump administration, is making decisions that are very eerily similar to decisions that regimes in history make when they progress to an authoritarianistic society. So before we start this episode today, I want to say this. I try not to make political content. That's not what I do. I don't have a background in politics. My background is in science. But some things in science are inherently political, unfortunately. And as such, it seems like these days the concept of authoritarianism is a very political issue. So this will be political as such. And we're going to get into a lot of heavy topics today. And if by off chance any of you are listening to this and you're ready to send me an angry email about how the decisions of the Trump administration aren't authoritarianistic and blah blah blah, before you send that email, I want you to listen to this episode, because in reality, a lot of things that are going on right now are authoritarianistic. But the purpose of today's episode is to talk about the science, because few people ever do. So, jumping in, today we're going to talk about what authoritarianism is, why it's an easy system of government for the most part, why democracies tend to slide into authoritarianism, and then, of course, we're going to talk about the psychology behind it, why people sort of gravitate to it, and then we're going to talk about concepts like groupthink and group radicalization. The very first episode I ever did on my podcast was about groupthink, so if you're interested in that, please definitely go check that out. That's season 1, episode 1, first episode I ever made. But I digress. Ladies and gentlemen, please go grab yourselves a nice steaming hot cup of coffee, add a little bit of maple syrup to it, and we will jump right in. So starting off, what is authoritarianism? Authoritarianism is a system of government in which one individual makes all the decisions for the nation or for the society. And so within authoritarianism, you have a variety of different, I guess, subsystems, if you will, right? Like monarchies, those are authoritarian regimes. The only exception are modern monarchies like Sweden, Norway, the UK, these constitutional monarchies. These are not authoritarian regimes because the monarch doesn't make decisions anymore. They don't really do anything. All they do is serve as the figurehead of the country. They serve as a head of state, but the actual decisions are upheld by democratically elected individuals. Parliament, the prime minister, whatever. But true monarchies, where you have a king or a queen and that individual makes the sole decisions for the nation, that is authoritarianism. In the same way where an emperor would be an authoritarian leader as well. So throughout China's history, there were many dynasties of many different emperors, and all of those are authoritarians. Because they are one individual making all the decisions for the nation. Therefore, in essence, authoritarian is simply a very strong centralized government, usually by one person, that strongly enforces the will of the state on the people, usually at a sacrifice of personal freedoms. Now, what is the difference then between fascism and today we're not going to talk about that per se, but it is an important thing to mention. Fascism is it's a more specialized form of authoritarianism in the same way a monarchy is, but with fascism, it's very aggressive. It's a strong centralized government with very few individual freedoms, and strong nationalism, a very strong military presence, typically to keep peace and crush protest or opposition movements. And oftentimes there's a cult of personality, for a lack of a better phrase, around the leader. So Kim Jong-un's North Korea 100% is fascism. The vast majority of the people view him as a god or a godlike leader, and there's a cult of personality around Kim Jong-un. And oftentimes in fascist authoritarian regimes like North Korea, religions are outlawed, oftentimes because the leader is the center of a religious movement or of the main religion. There is one exception, however, which is fascist authoritarian regimes where religion is centralized. It's a very important part, but it's only one allowed religion. So, I don't know, maybe Saudi Arabia could be an example of that. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is a strict authoritarian regime with fascist elements and a lesser degree of a cult of personality around the leader. But anyway, those are the two important definitions. So, authoritarianism is an easy form of government. And it's an easy form of government, especially to start with, if you're a premature civilization. If you're an early civilization, authoritarianism is really easy because you have one individual that's making all the decisions, and oftentimes it's more efficient. So if we go back, 100,000 years ago maybe, to when we had nomadic tribes of individuals broken up across the world. Did some of them have democracies? Maybe. I mean, we can't really say for sure, especially in prehistory before things were written. But when you have a small, close-knit group of people, like a small nomadic tribe or a small village, it is a lot easier and more efficient to have one central authority or person making the decisions and then delegating as such to people to go out and fulfill those tasks. So if you have a village in, prehistory North America, and the village is only 50 people, it's a lot easier to have a village elder that's put into power, who makes decisions and delegates to the other 49 members of the village what to do. Now that changes, though. Generally, authoritarianism is easier, and humans tend to follow the paths of least resistance, like water, and that is all evolutionary. But overall, authoritarian governments are easier when they start authoritarian from the ground up. When a system starts democratic and slides into authoritarianism, that's a harder system to occur. That's a harder thing to happen. While it does happen, and unnervingly we're seeing a lot of things like that happen here in the United States, it's more difficult than especially the scenario of a village of 50 people with an authoritarian leader. But because of that, because it's a little bit easier, evolutionarily speaking, humans tend to follow the paths of least resistance, just like all organisms do, which makes sense. Because from an evolutionary perspective, we're trying to conserve energy, and we don't want to go down elaborate processes of decision making if it may cost calories in the long run. And even in our modern society, people are still subject to these basic evolutionary drives. And as a whole, we have a large group of people, as we'll talk about in a little bit, with groupthink and party polarization or group polarization. People tend to behave very evolutionarily based, very more simplistically when they're part of a big group of people. And that's sort of what plays into authoritarianism. It's easy, and in certain situations, people follow it because it's the path of least resistance. Not all, but certain situations. And so from an authoritarian perspective, then, the other thing that we want to talk about is, why is it such an attractive form of government for certain individuals? Well, the simple reality is there's an old proverb, which is total power corrupts totally. And it's very true. And humans, as I mentioned, are evolutionary creatures. We are driven by a desire to secure resources for ourselves and for our offspring. And a lot of times, these evolutionary characteristics are exacerbated with certain personality types, and certain factors like narcissism, sociopathy go into play when it comes to a leader that comes out of nowhere in a democratic country and tries to take over the democratic country and turn it into an authoritarian regime. Power is very alluring to people, and that is a primordial thing. People are very social animals, but we respond very strongly to positive social interaction. And an example of positive social interaction would be accolades, would be groups of people saying how great we are. It's good. Anybody would like that. If you go up on stage and give a presentation or sing a song and everyone cheers and claps, you feel good. And that's magnified on a multitude of levels. So when you have an individual that decides, I want to become the supreme leader of a democratic country, it never works like that. But when that happens, an individual is motivated by power because our psyche inherently makes people greedy, because you want to secure resources to benefit yourself and your family. And that's evolutionary biology, and that applies with power as well. So you have power in that sense. You also have the accolades. Oftentimes, the charismatic leaders that end up being autocrats are very much attracted to accolades. And again, it plays into our evolutionarily predisposed drives of needing social interaction and desiring positive social input. And for the most part, these are the primary factors that, or the primary psychological things that go on in an individual who becomes an autocrat. And narcissism plays a big role. Narcissism plays into the love of self and also the desire to have a huge accolades, big following, etc. But now we're going to get into the stuff here, which I think that most of you tuned into this episode to listen for, which is, why do people like it so much? And I say this because not everyone likes autocratic regimes, of course. And as we're seeing in, California and Detroit and Chicago, thousands and thousands of people are coming out across the United States to protest the immigration raids, the illegal immigration raids, and all of the blatantly autocratic things that the government is doing. And they're coming out to protest it because, at least here in America, pretty much all of us until recently have grown up with this idea of personal liberties. And that is something that is very hard to break. But certain people like being told what to do, and autocrats and authoritarian systems offer that to people. They provide the what are you gonna do? They tell people what to do. But this goes further. In the beginning of this episode, I talked about groupthink and group radicalization. But the other aspect here is that people like taking orders from somebody. And in fact, about 65 to 66% of the population likes taking orders from somebody. They like being told what to do. And they will blindly respond to somebody of perceived authority just because they're of perceived authority. And I think the example that I can hear all of my psychology majors and psychiatrists and psychologists in the audience saying this experiment name right now. The Stanley Milgram experiment is the gold standard of highlighting this phenomenon. If you don't know, Stanley Milgram was a Yale psychologist, and from the time frame of 1961 to 1962, he conducted an experiment where he had two people in a room. One person was hooked up to an electrode, and the other person couldn't see that individual, just hear them. And he was in a room delivering shocks while being supervised by, and I'm using air quotes, an experimenter, an individual of perceived authority. And in 65% of cases, despite screaming from the actor on the other side, they didn't know he was an actor, but despite screaming from the actor on the other side, all that was required was simply the presence of an authority figure saying, please continue, for them to continue the experiment. And that highlights obedience in the face of authority. And in this experiment, 65% of people followed through with delivering the maximum shock until the end of the experiment. And another phenomenon highlights this as well, which is simply that we're evolutionarily social creatures, as I mentioned, and we want to fit in. But with that comes this interesting phenomenon, and about 66% of people in experiments conducted in a room of stooges, and stooges are actors, basically. Experiments were conducted in a room of actors where you had like 5 actors and 1 test subject. And everyone was given a form to fill out. And at periodically weird intervals, usually at the ring of a bell or whatnot, the actors would stand up. And then when the bell would ring again, they'd sit down. And they keep doing this. And in 66% of the time, the test individual started standing up and sitting down with them. And the idea here is because we are social creatures, the vast majority of us have a strong drive to fit in, And it's a drive that oftentimes is subconscious, and it results in us trying to fit into the group. And in the case of that experiment, standing up and down when the actors are doing just that. So how does this relate to autocracy? Well, this relates to autocracy because when you have an autocratic regime, that especially one that appears in a democratic nation like the United States, you will have a group of people that support them adamantly. They fall into the cult of personality with the individual, especially if we're going with a fascist autocratic regime. But they will follow that person, and then you'll have more and more people that don't necessarily agree with the ideas that the politician or that the government is saying, but their peers do. So they want to fit in, and you have more and more people that slowly fit in to this system because they're social creatures, and because we are all social creatures, and they want to fit in. And then additionally, once you're in the system, why do people just do whatever they say? Because 65% of people will blindly obey what they perceive to be authority. This was seen in the Nazi Germany. At the end of World War II, during the Nuremberg trials, many of the soldiers that did the horrible, heinous crimes of the Nazi regime were put on trial. And their excuse was always, I was just following orders. And many of them were sentenced because that's not a valid excuse. And in fact, that is why Stanley Milgram conducted the Stanley Milgram experiment, to show that 65% of people will blindly obey authority if it's just perceived authority, just because. Now, what does that mean for the rest, right? So when we look at American politics, let's say, Trump's approval rating is 38%. Does that mean that all 38% of those people are, blindly obedient to him? No, not necessarily. And if that's the case, why wouldn't it be higher, like 65%? If 65% of people in the Milgram experiment and successive experiments blindly obey authority, and if 66% of people will blindly follow what others are doing just because of what others are doing, well, the simple explanation for that is everyone's different. And real world population dynamics don't always respond the same way experiments will, but they give you ideas about how things will occur. And the other side of that as well is people will stop obeying. There's a point where the vast majority of people will stop obeying a command if it is too egregious for them to follow. Now, that wasn't necessarily demonstrated in the Stanley Milgram experiment, but when looking at cultures through history, you can see that's the case. And oftentimes, while people do have a desire to fit in for the most part, eventually their own survival instincts and the survival instincts of their friends and family will outweigh their desire to fit into a group. So speaking of groups, then, we're going to go into the last part of this episode, which is groupthink, right? How does groupthink play into the role of authoritarianism? Well, it simply, once you have a group of followers, as people go in, find themselves falling down the rabbit hole into that group of followers, as I mentioned through any of the other processes, oftentimes they forgo their own ideas to uphold the ideas of the group. And that's the basic idea of groupthink. And the reason that is the case goes back to evolution and our evolutionary urge to fit into social groups. Humans are social creatures, but we're not just social creatures. We live in groups. We need groups, and we have evolved to survive with other people, not solo. Are there people out there who live solitary lives? Of course, but again, we're talking averages here. And groupthink plays into that. When an individual who has a predisposition to groupthink ends up in this big group, they end up forgoing their own ideas and adopting the ideas of the group, which also goes directly into group polarization or group radicalization, which is the idea that as time goes on, the ideas of the group tend to become more and more extreme, or go to one extreme of the spectra or the other, right? Not just the political spectrum. Groupthink and group radicalization applies to a variety of different things. It's just politics tends to be the best exemplification of that, which makes sense, right? So when you look at the Trump movement here in America, the reason why you have a decent amount of people within that group that are so fervidly in support of whatever he does is because of groupthink, because they've become a part of this system, and they have forgone their own personal opinions to adopt the opinions of the group, A, and B, because after a long period of time of being in a group radicalization tends to occur, and especially in politics, in political groups, in sports groups where the central idea is pitting one team against another, or where there's a competitive nature to it. Group radicalization becomes a very strong thing, and so the ideas get more and more radical, and in an effort to stay fit into the group, the individual gets rid of more of their ideas and adopts more of the group's. And of course, this isn't in every scenario. This there are exceptions to this, and we have seen people fall out of groups. And the simple psychology behind that oftentimes is just they were able to take a step back and readopt their own personal ideas and see how far afield they've become from their personal ideas. And the last part of authoritarianism, the science behind it and why societies progress to it, is simple. I've also done another episode on it. Try and guess what it is. If you guessed fear, you'd be correct. Fear is an extremely powerful motivator. And again, it all goes back to evolutionary biology. And I did do an entire episode on fear, so if you're interested in that, please go take a listen to it. But it goes back into evolutionary biology. Fear is a very powerful motivator. And one thing that often happens is in an autocratic system of government, people are scared, right? The autocrat uses their own fear. So they use the price of commodities, the changing of the economy, the fear of if they're going to be able to have housing and whatnot. And they use that fear and they focus it on a specific group that the followers can focus their attention on. And every autocratic regime throughout history has had a different group that they focus it on. It just so happens that with Trump, it's immigrants. But after a while, that'll change as well. It's immigrants and anybody who disagrees with them naturally. But the fear becomes focused on that. And then it gets worse because as the authoritarian regime goes on, then you have fear that's added on of, well, if you disagree with the regime, there'll be punishments. And that's a fear tactic. And it's a fear tactic of a positive reinforcement to a desired outcome. And the desired outcome is continued support of the regime. And when I say a positive reinforcement, that's a reinforcement where you're adding something to the system to ensure the outcome you want. A negative reinforcement would be taking something away, right? So for example, a negative reinforcement would be, if you're trying to get your kid to do their homework, you take away video games until they do it. A positive reinforcement in the context of authoritarian regimes then would be in an effort to ensure that the base follows the rules and still follows the dear leader, you add the threat of punishment if they go to political rallies, speak out in protest, run against the candidate or the autocrat, etc., etc. And fear is probably the most powerful component of autocratic regimes, both in the initial part, which is finding something that people are afraid of or worried of, using that, and then providing a scapegoat for them to focus that fear and anger naturally on. And then, of course, in terms of using fear as a positive reinforcement to achieve a desired outcome, which is continued support to the regime. So overall, ladies and gentlemen, that is the science behind autocrats and authoritarianism. I know that this was a long episode, but it's an important topic because the last thing I want to leave y'all with is the simple question of how do you fight against it? And that is a very complex topic because the answer changes based on what stage you're in. If you're in a nation that's already authoritarian, how do you fight against it? Well, you mobilize. You speak out when you see wrongs. You correct the wrongs you can. You fight for the things you believe in. You mobilize other people to come out in support of those same causes, right? But how do you stop it in the first place? The most powerful way to stop it in the first place is take away the weapon that starts it all, which is fear. And I save fear for the end because it really is the most important part. If you take away the fear of a group and you don't provide a scapegoat for them because they don't have that fear in the first place, and you make sure that the leaders you have try their best to make sure that all the people are feeling heard, then you reduce the environment. You change the environment and you reduce the likelihood that it will be an environment conducive to authoritarianism. And at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, how do you resist it? Resist the fear. If you're in America, like so many of the people that listen to this podcast, the biggest thing you can do is stand up and fight for the things you believe in. One of my favorite quotes is a quote by a gentleman who's dead now by the name of Clarence Darrow. And it was, "As long as the world shall stand, there will be wrongs. And if nobody objected and nobody rebelled, those wrongs would last forever." And he was a Chicago lawyer who fought for the rights of kids during the civil rights movement. And again, this is a science channel, but the science of things like government and politics is inexplicably, I cannot say that word, is inherently tied with human nature and politics and everything like that. So the best thing you can do is stand up and fight for what you believe in, and don't let the fear of whatever authoritarian regime it is get to you. You have to resist it, because if you take away the fear, you take away the power. So, ladies and gentlemen, that was my episode for today. And if you listened to this episode and you got angry at me because I talked about Trump and how it's an authoritarian regime, sorry, I don't know what to tell you. Write me a letter and tell me that. I don't care. But I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And for all of you out there, especially in the United States, who are worried about everything that's happening, it's going to be okay. Just remember, the most important thing is to stand up and fight for what you believe in. And of course, to stand up and question everything. Have a great weekend, everybody.